I think in terms of it being sensational, it's sort of worth leading, I think, with the foreword that I wrote, or the whatever it is, whatever that's called. Because the preface, I don't remember what I call it, because I describe it as it's an internal document. It was never intended to be published. The reason that I ended up publishing it was because the ongoing superficial and, as a result, misunderstanding that people had of the significance of what is unspoken about childhood trauma, which is the parents who turn away, right? Most specifically, the mother who turns away, and how much psychic pain that created. The kickback to that I can imagine, or the people's reactivity to that in general, has been sort of the big feminist picture, which is it's always the mother who's blamed, and those are usually mothers themselves who feel that way. And I understand feeling that way. I don't think there's anything in there that is, I mean, that dynamic was really difficult for me, and it's much more powerful than anyone pays attention to in terms of identity and protection and, things like that. And so and that's the reality of my story. It's also a very forgiving book around my mother because it's dedicated to her. And if you get to the end, you see where we got. And we got there because of neurofeedback. I can imagine people saying things like, everybody goes through this. I wanted that myself, right? Did I need to have, let's say, the two big experiences, which are the mother turning away and then the episode in the attic, and then all of the other replications of that happened through my life? And I don't know the answer to that. It's just is as bad as it was. And where it comes down to is exactly what the research at Harvard says, which is that as significant as it is, abuse washes out as a predictor of mental health issue, of severe mental health issues, right? It doesn't predict, quote, borderline personality disorder. It doesn't predict suicidality or self-harm. Well, that's important. That's how critical the mother is, and how critical it is that she understands she has a baby and that she has a relationship with this baby that's in front of her. So that's got enormous societal implications and personal implications for people. And people who wander around, probably much like I did, wondering how could I feel so terrible, although I couldn't ask that question, and have so little have happened to me. And it just turns out it wasn't so little what happened to me, right? I blocked out what happened in the attic. I didn't have any memory of that until, once again, it was in a neurofeedback session, one of my very early C4, right? The vanilla protocol, C4 trainings, that I had a sudden flash of being held over the banister. And I couldn't shake it. I couldn't make nothing of it. There was no story there. There was a flash of an experience. So so I don't think you can publish a book that I hope to be as meaningful as this book, change the conversation, which is why I'm writing it. And with my hope that it can change the conversation toward meaningful understanding and then meaningful treatment of something that isn't even a disease. it's a condition. It's a condition of relationship that has to that I hope will be influenced by this book as well. And who turns against that? Those are the people who need the help the most. Like, why turn against that message? You know, except if you're hurting. And so that's usually what it is anyway, right? It's like the hateful people are often the most unconscious, which is, I don't even know what damaged is in a certain way, but I know how unconscious they are.
Yeah.
Unaware of themselves they are.
So if I understand what you just described, you were actually you had this tumultuous life through, like, from teenage years onward, all of this, all this chaos, right? But actually tracing that mentally back to this moment did not actually happen for you until relatively late in your life. So
I
what
was in my 50s. I was in my 50s.
you're in your 50s.
And two important things were happening. One, I had entered into a very deep sort of psychoanalytically attachment formed therapy. So both of those schools were involved in the guy's thinking, and he was an extraordinarily gifted therapist, and he is. I don't see him now, but he is. And the other thing was that 4 years into that, in the evocation of some of the worst of the suffering that I was going to feel, somebody introduced me to neurofeedback, and that's the story that I tell. So I tell a little bit of the story of discovering the depth of the concern that I could have known it from the facts of my life, but I didn't quite. And so I was sort of introduced to myself via this other person and ongoing therapy with him. And then in a way that's even more true, introduced to myself through training my brain.
Yeah. So to kind of begin from first steps or whatever, you must have had some thinking around why you lived through all of this trauma. I mean, some of this, that what's somewhat fascinating about your journey and in the story and the history of neuroscience is that there is a sort of there's kind of a parallel path in terms of the rise of the understanding of both neuroplasticity and also the way, with roots of research around the effect of trauma on the brain. Right. So talk to me a little bit about how you thought because you were already a psychotherapist starting very early on, like as a young adult, right? Coming out of treatment and coming out of residential and right, do you mind kind of talking about where your thinking was and what that process was like, sort of historically?
Well, in my mid to late 30s, I became the clinical director of a residential treatment program for the most severely disturbed kids in the state of Massachusetts, and I don't know how quickly I learned this, but it became undeniable that talk therapy was not useful to them. Now, the way this was usually thought about, and which I would have a tendency to think about then too, was that they were untreatable. We wouldn't blame the treatment. We blamed the kids, right? Still happens. This is not just then. This is what goes on everywhere. So that term, untreatable, is quite often used and constantly wrong. So, well, I mean, there may be untreatable people. I don't know yet because we haven't been able to work with everybody with neurofeedback and DBR. So, so I did therapy with some of the kids there. Two of the kids I worked with had dissociative identity disorder, so I learned about that. During the time I was there, which was 17 years, I worked there for 17 years. I learned about attachment, which no one was talking about either. In fact, our most important contact at the Department of Social Services said anything that I did not learn in graduate school is not true. It's not relevant to me. And he hadn't learned about attachment theory, and right. Um,
What
uh,
year? What year are we talking about?
well, it was in the 80s.
Okay.
But attachment theory was, I mean, Bowlby had written already, but attachment theory wasn't big yet. It really came back through Alan Shore and his work in the late 80s, early 90s, I think it was. So, but I was learning about it in little poorly attended workshops, and and I and I started to see how central the lack of parenting was. I started putting things together, kind of, uh, well, the best that I could. Starting to understand that kids could not. There'd be no way for a baby to understand affect regulation if there was no parent there to help them learn affect regulation. I mean, there's no way to do it. There's no benefit to it. You get no attention. They were getting no attention anyway, by and large. So there was I mean, and so they ended up being parented in institutions for most of their lives. And most of the kids that were in my treatment center went on and were in adult treatment centers.
Hmm.
One of them was an arsonist, and I'm not sure if the story is about her, but I was told by a DMH person that one of their patients who set fires constantly, they finally gave her neurofeedback and she stopped setting fires. It's like, oh, I said, well, is that a big story around? I mean, do people really hear that? And it's like, anyway.
And can I stop you for a
Yeah,
second?
sure.
What was your own mental state during this time? Because one of the things that just stops me regularly is thinking about you at 75 and 80 years old, and really by the journal struggling to make it, day by day or whatever. Is that what was happening, or were you sort of
Not that
skating?
late, not that late,
Not
but
that late.
in
Okay.
my 50s and my 50s for sure.
Yeah.
And the nature of the fact that my struggle was so severe was that it was surfacing. And the effect was as bad as the kids. But I could control it outside of the office, which they could never do,
Yeah.
right? Um, uh, but I think that through working with them and through learning about this core issue of the mother who turns away and the baby who keeps trying, which is this research is just coming out that's showing that that's the issue. It's not abuse.
Mhm.
That the that and my therapist's willingness to engage very deeply with this, and not only to engage very deeply, but to demand that I engage very deeply.
Mm.
Those are conditions that had to be met, that had to be there, and that I had to meet to get better. And so the agony of those years was just the part of the book that you've read most of so far. is those years of a psychotherapeutic contending with it without much support to the brain.
Mm.
And I didn't take medication. I wasn't, I was not interested at all in medication. I wasn't depressed. It's the only medication that they really had then. I was in agony, but I wasn't anxious. I was terrified. And that terror would arise when the conditions were present, and the conditions were present most often in the therapy itself. And I would close off to those conditions so that I could continue to work. I had suicidal children that I was working with, either as a therapist or as a clinical director, as well as the other clinicians. I had to rise up to the occasion. And I did have the sense as well that as I was going through all of this, it wasn't a narcissistic exercise. It was serving my understanding of the very people that I was trying to treat, and to help them understand themselves better, and the other clinicians, to help them understand their patients better.
Mhm.
So, but it was definitely the hell realm. I mean, but it was sequestered. It was sequestered away from my job, and I don't know really exactly how I did that.
Yeah.
I don't, but I did.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's just regularly something where it strikes me as I'm listening, like this, just mysteries that we just go through in this text. And I think the other piece of this that's so compelling is that, as somebody who has been largely, outside until, I mean, I'm not involved in any therapy at all directly with people. I really am just doing, being a participant in the conversations of people who are doing that work. But so my sense of it is really sort of distant of what that whole realm is. And my understanding, this is something that seems to me really necessary for people to understand, that it's not just the process of being present with people who are struggling with these kinds of histories, with this having gone through devastating circumstances, but it's actually understanding what is happening there. And I think this is the thing that the actual the blow by blow descriptions of what it feels like for you, as of your journal entries, really makes this clear that this is not just a matter of like, oh yeah, we work with these kids and they're messed up and we don't know, there isn't anything to do. It's there is a sense of running through that you do feel there is some progress. That's at least my reading of it. There's a sense of some progress being made, of some unearthing that's happening in the process. And I just got to a section where you're talking about how the point is for it to not for there to be hope, but for it to be over, to be past the trauma field. And I find that just a really, really well structured kind of way of thinking about it. And you draw parallels to times in history when brutality has been much more systematic. This is systematic as well, but in a different kind of way.
It was coming to terms with yet another reality, right? Which was that in 2016, I was psychologically, emotionally, historically challenged, greatly challenged by the election of a rapist for president of the United States, a con man, but a particularly vicious one, in terms of his treatment of women and his disregard of women and what I could tell of children as well. And but it was the fact of the number of claims that were made by women of his sexual assaults, and he's been convicted of one of them, which is the person who dared to bring it forward. So one of the things that really what happened there was that I was shocked, really, that with all the neurofeedback I had had, I could feel so unmoored by this event. I felt worse about his election than I did about 9/11. And the planes for 9/11 planes flew over my kitchen. I heard them. They were not very far above. They were 100 feet up. They didn't go very far high up. And I went back into therapy. I've been out of therapy. Went back into therapy with the same person that I've been speaking about. I had some coming to terms to do, but I couldn't do it with therapy. And so I also started to do neurofeedback again, and very quickly I could arrange. My brain got a hold of it, but I was left with a very important question. It's one that I think we're still trying to address, which is what can neurofeedback do in terms of this level of trauma that I had suffered as a kid, mostly, and what did I need? What was there anything else that I needed? And Ruth had introduced me to Frank Corrigan, to his work, and had invited me to meet him before the pandemic. But I didn't take her up on it for a couple of reasons. But I had this very profound question. And a friend of mine said, how can and I started to talk to Frank seriously in 22, at my friends saying to me, how can you are you sure you want to publish a book on trauma of this intense as the book you're writing, and never have had the experience of DBR, which she said I think is fantastic. So that's how that came about.
It's key for me that people actually understand what is happening, and that's what I'm getting from the writing that I'm reading is that it's not just the empathy part. It's not just the people should not have to have these difficult backgrounds, and they should be able to, but it's actually understanding the actual what are the dynamics that are at play here, and how is it possible for us. Finally, the question to me is as a community, how do we respond in such a way that we are, and you reference regularly, not a bystander? This is something that comes up a couple of times, or repeatedly actually, that the person that you're talking to, when you're talking to Frank, that he's not a bystander, that he's actually a witness, he's involved, he's directly related to you, is attached. And so I wonder, when you think about what that looks like, what that conversation looks like for people, there's some references in there of wondering, and you've talked about this, how do people who don't come from this kind of a history, who haven't struggled to face this, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how do we actually have that conversation as part of a drawing these things. This is kind of what that book is about, right? The hidden book of first things. There's a reason why these things are hidden.
There are many. It's a hard question to answer because one of my hopes is that people begin to understand the impact of family life where the parents aren't there, in whatever way they're not there, even in the kindest way they're not there. But if they're not there, it broadens the effect of trauma. Now, I was actually turned away from, and I think, and it was unrepaired. And I think there are people that I've talked to who have, I think, never felt any connection to their mother because there just wasn't one. The mother was an addict or, suffering so badly herself, she could never turn to the baby. There was never any relationship. I think I had one that got torn up. But it's very difficult outside of an audience that is self-identified as traumatized to raise this issue because people get defensive. They get defensive for themselves as parents, or if they have a troubled child, more defensive, or if they don't recognize what has happened to them, they want to belittle that reasoning. I'm very glad Carlin Lyons Ruth did this research for all kinds of reasons. But for us to really have to look at how important parents are, and particularly mothers, that's also a problem. Is in a misogynistic society to all of a sudden say, well, you know what, the mother's even more important than the father in the early stages of childhood. So I think that if people can take this in, that in itself, and Ruth's talking about it and Frank's talking about it, I mean, it's becoming more a dominant idea. Bessel's talking about it, that it's not so much the abuse, although that's been the focal point, that's been the focus of things. It's been on the rape or the beatings or whatever awful thing happened to people. But it's that they were unprotected, and there was no mother. There was no mother to protect them. I once remember seeing a Sophia Loren movie and being just stunned by it many, 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 many years ago. I don't remember the name of the movie, but it was a war movie. And it was the mother and the daughter, and Sophia Loren was the mother. And it was getting through a bombing. And she was protecting her daughter, as she was very aware of her daughter's experience the whole time. And I thought, I didn't understand it. I really had no grounds of understanding that. And I think in general, people have been more affected by what looks like a benign set of circumstances, particularly if you're middle class or wealthy, a benign set of circumstances than they have any self-awareness of. And it can create the problems that you will read about when you read the first book. In the first book, the way that I dealt with my history was there's about 2 pages of lines of things that happened, because I had to tell these things to my therapist, who's named Arles in the book. And I wanted to get through it as quickly as possible. I didn't want to talk about it. And I didn't want to talk about it, I think, in part because I didn't think that was the truth of where my pain came from. And my biggest dilemma was this attachment dilemma. And people don't know any of this, Lars. They don't know that, and they don't know that it's in the brain. So Caroline Lyons Ruth can even talk about the effects that she sees in the brain and not know there's anything you can do about it except put a person on Prozac or whatever it is. Ridiculous. But they don't know about that being a problem at all. And, it's the weakness of the person, or, you know, uh, genetic fault or something, so it changes the entire conversation. Well, but it will only change the conversation if people will allow that to happen. And that's, I don't have all I could do is say, it didn't happen to my satisfaction with the Norton book. So then I decided to write a book that was personal. And the DBR book comes later because that's when I see what may be and may not be ultimately, but seems to be a limit to neurofeedback. It directs neurofeedback toward the back of the head, and that may do more than we've been able to do so far. But I don't know. I don't know because it's so complicated in there.
Yeah.
But if the two main messages of this book are its attachment and it's, there's very powerful treatment scenes in this book. But it's also fundamentally the brain, and we have to treat the brain. And if those two messages get out there, I don't even think there's going to be that much of pushback.
Right. Right.
So.
Yeah. Is there a sense that there is an understanding that attachment is the core issue now, or is that no?
No,
It's still
this will still be abuse. In fact, I was watching The Pit, this show, and now it's in an ER setting. So an emergency room doctor would say this, but she says it as though it's a fact of truth. And she said, abuse trumps attachment, or abuse is worse than the mothering, or something like that. I mean, it just said straight out as though it's a fact of life, which is completely wrong.
Right.
It's wrong. It's right if you have to deal with a broken arm, right?
Right.
But if you have to deal with two broken arms, then it's like, okay, there's a problem here. So but they don't know it because it's said like it's and that's the common perception. So it's really switching things around a lot.
Yeah. It's interesting that so for me, I have this instinctive sort of response to the idea that one of the things that Frank has said is that the human system, our nervous systems, spontaneously want to clear shock. We want to heal, like it just heals itself if allowed the space to do that. And so that's in some ways what the DBR, what the space that's created by a good DBR therapist is about, is creating that a place for the person to just kind of go through their shock and clear it. And part of why that speaks to me so clearly is, there really is this like instinctive response to that, but I love how that really relates to that whole attachment piece, because if the point is that the human system wants to heal naturally, then it needs some attachment location for that process to actually take place. And this is why it matters less what the actual abuse is, as you're saying. Like, obviously we don't want people to be assaulted, but the thing that is really makes the difference, and this is true, I've been reading stuff about people who come back from deployment with lots of trouble, and there's a thing that puzzles the mental health workers who work with them, why some people seem to be able to bounce back from being in extremely traumatic situations, and other people come back and they go off the deep end.
Right. And that's not answered. And I think the vulnerability that I can feel about the hidden book is that if I don't answer that sufficiently, And again, it makes me glad for this research from Harvard that it just becomes a personal fault of my own and not something that you can generalize. The reality is it gets generalized through DBR. You can't generalize it through neurofeedback because we don't even know. I mean, we have an idea about that we're lowering arousal and we're taking some of the shock away. We are actually, or at least we are impacting the effects of shock on the nervous system. But recently Frank said in one of his consult groups, he said we have. It's clear now that DBR is a brain therapy. It's not a body therapy. And it's not a psychotherapy. It's a brain therapy. And neurofeedback is a brain therapy. And the answer to the psychiatrists or psychologists' questions about why some people are so brutally affected and others not by very similar circumstances in war is that they have a whole file of brutal circumstances that they got sent to war with. And once the draft was eliminated, that was even more true because the people who would, the men and women who would volunteer to go into the army were often those who were quite brutalized. So they were self-selecting. Suicide rates got high, are high among combat veterans. So, and it's not from the combat. It's from what we think is that it's not only from the early wounding that happened to these people as children that was completely unaddressed and trivialized, but it also is the separation from the only family they've had, which is their buddies in the war. And those that on top of being veterans lost their friends or their significant others because of an IED or whatever. I mean, what chance do they have?
Yeah.
I mean, it's horrible. This is horrible. Yeah. I think the other thing about writing this book, both of these books at this moment in my life, is that I'm pretty impervious to people's any negative response that I can imagine because I know this is true. And if it could take a while for other people to get that it's true, I hope it doesn't. And that part of that is what you and I do together.